And now I'll introduce Richard. Richard Smith wrote his UCLA History PhD thesis on China's class structure and the contradictions of market reform in China. He held postdoctoral appointments at the East-West Center in Honolulu and at Rutgers University New Brunswick. He has published articles on the Chinese Revolution, China's transition to capitalism, and capitalist development and China's environment for Against the Current, New Left Review, Monthly Review, and the Ecologist. He has written about capitalism, capitalist economic theory, and the environment for the Journal of Ecological Economics, Capitalism Nature Socialism, Real World Economics Review, truthout.org, Adbusters, and other media. He published Green Capitalism, The God That Failed, and is now completing a book on China's engine of ecological apocalypse. He is a founding member of System Change, Not Climate Change. And I and a few others in this room had the opportunity of working with Richard a few years ago, and we had a great time with him. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. It's really great to see you again. I had such a great time in Missoula when I was there before with my wife, Nancy Holmstrom. You people were so impressive, so sophisticated, had such a great understanding of the crisis we face, and we're so open to understanding the kind of radical transformations that we need to make to save ourselves here. Let me kill this phone here. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So, I'm not going to rehearse all the ecological, environmental problems we face. I'm sure you're very familiar with them in Montana, given the forest fires you've had in recent years, the rising CO2 emissions, the concentrations, the melting ice caps, intensified storms, forest fires above the Arctic Circle. I grew up in Seattle, and I couldn't imagine that there would be forest fires in the Olympic National Rainforest, where I used to hike as a kid. But that's the reality we face today. So Greta Thunberg, whom you probably know. Everyone know Greta?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, okay. So Greta, when she went to the Congress, the US Congress, a few days ago to speak to them, they asked for her testimony. She didn't give them any testimony. She just handed them the IPCC special report, global warming of 1.5 degrees C from September, October 2018, and said, here, read this. Don't listen to me, read your own scientists, listen to your scientists. Okay, so what did the scientists say? What they said was, I'll read this briefly, very briefly. If emissions continue at current rate, atmosphere will warm by as much as 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels between 2030 and 2052. That's in your lifetime. Further, warming could happen. Okay. If we're going to keep temperatures below, rising above 1.5 degrees, anthropogenic CO2 emissions must decline by about 45%, 50% worldwide from 2010 to 2030. That's like 20 years from now. This would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure, including transportation and buildings, and industrial systems. These systems transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale and imply deep emissions reductions in all sectors, a wide portfolio of mitigation options, and so on. So Miles Allen, Oxford University climate scientist who's an author of the report, said, it's telling us we need to reverse emissions trends and turn the world economy on a dime. Drew Schindel of Duke University, another author, said, what would this look like? It would mean, it would include such things as no more gas-powered vehicles, a phase out of coal-fired power plants, and airplanes running on biofuels. It's a drastic change. There are huge, huge shifts. This would really be an unprecedented rate and magnitude of change. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned world leaders, do what the science demands before it's too late. So given all this, you might think that governments around the world would responsibly meet their climate emergency and with emergency plans to prevent ecological collapse. Bold proposals for deep emissions reductions in all sectors, far-reaching transitions in energy, land, infrastructure, and manufacturing, and so on. In fact, not at all. And not only that, but the solutions don't require huge technical breakthroughs. They're really pretty obvious. You know, we mostly just have to stop doing what we're doing. Stop new fossil fuel drilling, stop gas drilling, stop producing and registering fossil fuel vehicles, drastically curb air travel, ration fossil fuels, curtail manufacturing and construction. That would be the first step. The second step would be to force through an immediate transition to renewable energies. But this is not happening. To the extent that we hear any response at all from responsible government officials, it's more of the same carbon taxes or fantasy tech fixes like carbon capture and so forth. What I've tried to argue in my work, and I would suggest if you want to pursue this a bit further, look at two of my articles, okay? One is called, that's the one I'm talking about based today. It's called An Eco-Socialist Path to Limiting Global Temperature Rise to 1.5 degrees C. And the other is called 6 Theses on Saving the Planet. They're both at systemchange.climatechange.org. That's a website. It's an eco-socialist website. I'm a co-founder of that and have a few papers there, and lots of other people have very good papers there too. So I'd suggest you look at that. What I've argued in my work is that the problem is to date, all efforts to mitigate CO2 emissions have foundered on the basic contradiction between the need to prioritize economic growth and the need to save the environment. And that's because we live in an economic system built on perpetual growth. Given capitalism, economic growth and profit maximization must be systematically prioritized over all other considerations, including emissions reduction, or companies will fail, the economy will collapse, and mass unemployment will be the result. Global warming will kill us in the long run, but economic collapse would kill us in the short run. And this is, I've argued, the ultimate contradiction of capitalism. We have to destroy your future, our children's future, to hang on to our jobs today. This is the crazy system we live in. What I try to outline in that article is the sorts of radical retrenchments and deindustrializations, industrial closures and retrenchments that we would have to make if we're going to suppress emissions to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And then the kind of political, and then following that, I discussed the kind of political economic arrangements that would take. And I try to make this in the conclusion of the article. It talks about AOC's Green New Deal, of which I'm a strong supporter of the Green New Deal, of her plan. Even though it doesn't go far enough, nonetheless, it's a great start. And in particular, her argument for decarbonization, I think, has the potential to look to call forth much more radical transformation of society. Okay, so what would we have to do if we're gonna suppress emissions? You know, people talked about well, we can have carbon taxes and so forth. I'm not going to go through the carbon tax arguments right now. I'll leave them for you to read in the paper because they're not. The carbon tax scam. It's not really a strategy to reduce emissions. It's a strategy to avoid reducing emissions. That's the whole point of carbon tax and cap and trade and so forth like that. The way to reduce emissions is just reduce emissions. The government just has to order a shutdown of fossil fuel production, dramatic curtailments and phase outs of fossil fuels, dramatic rationing of airplane flights, immediate stopping production of gasoline-powered automobiles and diesel fuels, and dramatic cuts across the board in all kinds of industries. Petrochemicals are the biggest use of fossil fuels, even more than gasoline for cars in the future. They're growing at exorbitant rates. So we would have to suppress transportation emissions across the economy. Just so you know, the share of emissions produced in the U.S. are about 28%, about 29% by transportation, about 28% for electricity generation. Industry contributes about 22% of emissions. Commercial and residential, that is heating and lighting and so forth, about 11%, and industrial agriculture about 9%. So that's the distribution of emissions production in the economy. So if we're going to drastically reduce emissions, cut them by half in 20 or 30 years, we have to suppress them in all these industrial sectors, not just energy. It's not just power plants. It's not just electric cars. We need dramatic suppression of emissions across the whole economy. Well, that would mean, as the industrialists see right away, massive industrial shutdowns. But what I argue is kind of I have a pretty radical take on this, in which I argue that basically we have to do that. We have to shut down industries, and we have to phase out industries. We have to shut down most of the oil industry, virtually, almost entirely the coal industry, although you still need coal for some steel production and so forth. You need to dramatically suppress these. You need to shut down the production of all kinds of disposable products from styrofoam packaging to iPhones to automobiles to IKEA furniture, all these sorts of things that are designed to be thrown away. We have to completely abolish those kinds of production, because otherwise we just can't have a sustainable planet. You know, you just can't have a sustainable planet if you have an economy based on production of waste. So we need to drastically retrench many industries and close other industries down entirely. Like plastics, it's just a huge, people know, just a huge problem. And the only solution there really is to stop producing most single-use plastics. I mean, I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, and we lived without this stuff. We weren't living in caves, we survived. It was manageable. We don't need this. You need to do away with disposable products in large part. I mean, maybe for medical use or something, you need some things, but not really very much. And rigorously control the kinds of things that we do need. So a lot of petrochemicals we need to, like pesticides and so forth, and industrial fertilizers need to be just abolished. And other chemicals need to be rigorously controlled so they're not spread into the environment, and so on. So we would need to cut down production of autos. We need to cut down shipping, air traffic. That's just in transportation. We need to cut down plastics. We need to cut back toxic industries, and so on and so forth. And to do that, we would thereby unemploy millions of people, tens of millions of people. Well, we need to shut these industries down to save the humans. So what about these unemployed people? What I argued is that we need to have a jobs program for them, like a WPA type jobs program, to create new jobs for those workers and paid at exactly the same scale and benefits they have, but in different work. Those workers deserve work, deserve jobs. They just don't deserve the jobs they've got. We need to create other jobs. We need renewable energy. We need all kinds of things that we don't have. We need to transition to renewable energy. We need to eliminate all kinds of uses production, and we need to create jobs for people in environmental restoration, infrastructure repair, expansion of public transit, commuter biking, development of shared vehicles, heating and environmental retrofitting, upgrading, improving our schools, expanding medical care, expanding services and facilities for retired workers, expansion of organic farming, and more. There are endless jobs that need to be done in society. Corporations don't find those profitable, so they don't do them. But we need to re-employ those workers from destructive industries into industries that are socially beneficial. And so the way to do that is with a jobs program. So what I argue is that we need to basically, since companies can't put themselves out of business, they're responsible to shareholders. And actually some of the shareholders are workers themselves through their pension plans. So I'm not calling for expropriation of the industries. I'm saying that we need to nationalize them, but buy them out, basically, as much as possible. Buy out the oil companies, buy out the coal companies, buy out Boeing and General Motors and the auto producers and the chemical companies, the petrochemical. Take these companies into public hands so that we can phase those who need to be phased out completely and repurpose the others and redirect them to producing what we need, what society needs, and gear them to produce the minimum that we need to produce to maintain a habitable world for ourselves and leave enough for future generations and other species to live. So the argument basically is that we need to nationalize the major fossil fuel industries and the downstream major industrial fossil fuel consumers. We need to create a jobs program for those displaced workers, and we need to hothouse a transition to rapid transition to renewable energies and so forth like that. Okay, so AOC's program calls for much of this. And though she doesn't explicitly call for any industrial shutdowns, she does call for, she issues a full-throated call for decarbonization, in effect throwing the gauntlet down and challenging the system to find a way to do this. And what I think is going to happen is that the push for decarbonization will inevitably, if, you know, it's not happening under Trump, but if the Democrats get elected, or if anybody decides to actually address this problem before we all die, they're going to have to, if pushing for decarbonization is going to raise the issue of nationalization, because how else are they going to do it? So a nationalization in turn, once you nationalize the coal and oil producers, then that's going to raise the question of, well, what do you do about the consumers? Autos, aviation, petrochemicals, plastics, construction, synthetics, manufacturing, shipping, tourism, and so on. Well, you have to nationalize those too, because or many of them, if they can't make it on their own without fossil fuels, in order to transition them to a sustainable mode of production, okay? And that in turn will raise more radical demands for democratic processes. Who should decide what gets produced in society? Right now, we have a system in which boards of directors, corporate CEOs and boards of directors make decisions, critical decisions about the future of our planet. Those are unelected officials. We don't vote on them. They're private heads of private corporations. Well, we need to have a vote on the economy. You know, we have a democracy, but it's just a capitalist democracy. We get to vote on politicians, but we don't get to vote on what's important, which is the economy. And we need to have a say in that so that we can transform our economy so that we can make decarbonization work, because we have to shut down companies and create new companies or new enterprises. And the only way to do that is with a rationally planned economy and under public ownership. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I want to stop talking. I want to hear what you people think and have to say. And so I want to hear your questions and comments about this. And could you just say your name so I can write your name down, and then I'll keep track who's who?
Sure. I'm Gemma Sladich.
Deborah.
Gemma, yeah. Gemma.
Okay.
Yeah. So the general thing that I'm hearing is that, like, the Green New Deal is a good place to start, correct? Would you think that's a good, like, right turn transition, sort of? Or, and, like, how do we, like, as students get the Green New Deal, like, going? How do we promote that, kind of? Because it's sounding like that's a good start to what we need to do.
Well, the Green New Deal is a pretty hot topic across the country, and there are all kinds of variations of this. People have come up with their own. If you want to look, I would suggest, I happen to be in the DSA. Do people know anything about the DSA?
Woo!
Okay, right, okay. So the DSA has its own guiding principles of the Green New Deal. I suggest people look at that. Go to the DSA website and look at that, okay? This paper that I wrote kind of in support of getting that thing written in the DSA, okay? So, and contributed to writing that document. So look at that. But the point is that, and it calls for nationalization of fossil fuels too, and creating jobs and so forth. So we want to push these ideas in society. We need to forcefully articulate these, because right now in the mainstream there is no solution. Everybody wants to just keep kicking the can down the road. Oh, well, we can't close down fossil fuel companies because that'll throw people out of work. Well, right, we have to say, and so the argument there is that, well, so we can't deal with the crisis because that'll throw people out of work and bankrupt companies, and therefore we'll have to kick the can down the road to the next generation, right? Well, we have to say, look, we do have to close down those companies. I'm very sorry, but we have to close them down. Those workers need jobs, but we have to give them other jobs. And so, and the companies need to be bought out because, you know, some of them are owned by evil capitalists, but, you know, many capitalists are evil, many are not so evil. It's not a question, this is not a moral issue there. It's an issue of how can we transition to a rational society. I'm not looking for a class war here. I'm not looking to hang the capitalists from the lamppost, though I might think that's a good idea for many of them, like the heads of and so forth. But the reality is we're not in a position to do that, and we don't want to do that because these companies are also about 25% of fossil fuel companies are owned by workers' pension plans. So what do we say to workers? We're going to bankrupt your pension plan by nationalizing expropriating Mobil oil? No, we're not going to say that. We're going to say we're going to buy out Mobil oil and we're going to phase out Mobil oil, but ExxonMobil, but you're going to be whole. We're not going to expropriate you, and we're going to transition your pension fund into renewable energy, something like that. Okay, so we have right now we're in a phase in which to a large extent the struggle is based on ideas, on fighting for these ideas in the real world, and on struggles to force governments to pay attention. I mean, Greta Thunberg is so amazing because she doesn't have any solutions. She just says, look, you have to do something right now. Don't tell me about doing something in 10 years, 2030 or 2045. You know, Amazon says they want to, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, you know, his employees went out on strike, joined the climate strike last Friday. And so he says, and they urged Amazon to do more. So Bezos says, well, we'll reduce emissions by 2045. Oh, great. Thanks a lot, Jeff Bezos. 2045, that's really great. Your whole business model is completely unsustainable. I mean, the notion of a company that is totally invested in flying stuff from China to here as a means to make it, this is just so crazy. We cannot do that. I'll say there's one rational point in Donald Trump's politics, which is that we should basically make most of what we produce, what we need here. We don't need to import it from China. The only reason we import it from China is not because China has some special terroir, you know, like you can only grow certain crops in China. Mostly, 90% of what we buy in China is because they have semi-slave labor with a police state. That's the basis of their whole economy for the last 30 years. Has been the incredibly intense exploitation of those workers who are working for wages near the level of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. That's the only reason companies went there. And also because they didn't have any EPA, any OSHA, any kind of restrictions on pollution. So all the dirtiest industries in the world went to China. Well, that's just so crazy to have those ships going back and forth across the ocean, making stuff there to ship halfway around the world that you could make perfectly well here. So, I think that much international trade needs to be done away with, abolished. It's just so pointless. I mean, we can make that stuff here. We used to make it here. You just have to pay people a decent wage. Thank you very much. So they can produce it. Anyway, and also abolish disposable production of stuff, so you don't have to make it over and over and over again. Anyway, and the Chinese workers have plenty to do in China. Okay, so anyway, so it's two things: the ideas and the struggles politically to put pressure on governments. Okay. Sorry to go on there so long about that.
No, I like that. Thank you. It was good.
So if part of system deconstruction is communities controlling their local resources, who exactly is buying out those oil and coal companies, and who has power over that transition?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that we have to talk about the community of the United States in this case, and the community of the world, because many of these companies are multinational companies. I mean, ExxonMobil is based in the US, so the US would have to nationalize it and take it over. BP is owned in Britain, so Britain would have to, or maybe there'd have to be some international arrangement. But the fact is, we have to buy them out to phase them out some way. Now, the argument that I made in this paper is about the U.S. It's not about Britain. It's not about Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia already has a nationalized oil industry. It's all Aramco. It is the whole industry of the whole country. But it's a big problem for countries like the whole Middle East, Saudi Arabia to Algeria and so forth. All of these countries many of them are heavily dependent, if not almost entirely dependent, on oil production. So what do? Well, we have to find a solution, people. And your generation have to think of a solution, because they basically have to shut down most of their economy. I mean, that's what they produce, is oil. But, don't they deserve a living? Yes, they do, but we have to find something else for them to do besides oil. So the community issue about which community should take over the companies and buy them out or take them over would vary from country to country, or industry to industry.
And how long do you think, if a jobs program was put in place, would it take to phase workers from a coal or oil industry into renewable energy, as far as actual job training goes, because the skills don't always translate? So how long would that take time-wise, and how extensive, or how, the scale of that issue seems pretty massive?
Well, there actually are some studies about that, and show that and they've actually done some in-field research which shows that, in fact, it's pretty easy. Oil drillers and coal miners are pretty mechanical kind of people. And those mechanical skills are pretty easily translatable to installing solar panels and building windmills and so on and so forth. And in fact, in places, many of those workers are doing exactly that. I mean, windmills have been put up on the tops of mountains in Appalachia, and they're being built by former coal miners. So I think for many of those jobs, it's pretty easy transition, really. But you would need a program to pay them, and guarantee. I mean, the key thing about this, AOC's calls for, AOC's program calls for the abolition of unemployment, basically that everybody should be guaranteed a good job. And that's fine, that's great. But what I'm saying is to make it just a little bit more specific, that we need a guarantee to those fossil fuel workers, the workers at ExxonMobil, at Dow Chemical, at Peabody Coal. We need an explicit commitment to those workers in those industries that you will get the same pay and benefits in a new job, and the government will guarantee that. That's the only way we're going to be able to win their support to do what we need to do to save our children and their children.
My name's Josh. I'm wondering how you would respond to a critique of buyouts that maybe we've been buying these fossil fuel companies out via subsidies for many years already, and that any money that would go towards a buyout should purely be towards job retraining and towards the efforts at transition that you're talking about. But buying out ExxonMobil is something we've been doing for, going on 20 years.
I'm actually not aware. Could you explain that a little more, Josh? How much of ExxonMobil has been bought out by the
well, just based on tax exempt statuses, incentivizing drilling programs in different areas. I mean, they've been under an umbrella of capitalist protection for so long that they really don't function like they don't function to the definition of a capitalist open market corporation, and they don't function to the definition of the socialist industrial image that you're talking about. They haven't for a long time. That's at least
they've had many subsidies and many grants for all kinds of things for more than a century.
Right.
So yes, you're right. That's been going on for a long time. And in my article, I said, well, of course, I proposed a buyout for these straight buyout at current market prices, but of course, all of this would have to be discounted for the environmental harm that they've done. So in that case, maybe might not end up paying us instead of the other way around. But still, yes, you're right. The public investment in those companies for so long, it gives us even more right to say about what needs to be done with them. But for those companies, the oil and coal companies, mostly we're talking about shutdowns and phase outs. For the downstream industries that are dependent on fossil fuels, like autos and aircraft, airlines, transportation industries, rail and shipping and so forth, maybe they can be reconfigured, reorganized to survive on other technologies, like renewable energy or something. But also we need to abolish the auto industry is so silly. It's just for decades. It's since its inception, really. Actually, not since Ford, but since General Motors, since the 1920s, it's been based on selling you a new car every 2 or 3 years. That was the holy grail was always to get you trade your car in after 1 year. That would be perfect. But they've always tried to stretch it. So American cars in the 1950s were so crappy that they fell apart by 100,000 miles. And it was only when there were Japanese imports and German imports in the 1960s that were actually much better cars in terms of quality control and so forth, that the U.S. industry shaped up a little bit and they last longer. But still, the basic idea is to get you to exchange it as soon as possible. And that is just such incredible waste. It's just it's just a gargantuan waste of resources and labor and energy that goes into producing these. They should be basically built automobiles should be built like Volkswagen Beetles, in the 1960s, that could basically be rebuilt forever and don't change very much and don't need to be upgraded very much, but can be upgraded. So, you need a electric version of something like that can be simply reproduced and instead of all this focus on style and, pointless luxuries and obese vehicles. I live in New York City. And the same as every car around here is a Suburban or a Cadillac Escalade. Ginormous things, They weigh about 6,000 pounds and they get worse gas mileage than Cadillac Eldorados in the 1950s. It's just such a huge waste. We need to just completely reconstruct that industry so that it produces vehicles that are rebuildable, upgradable, and durable and last for a long time, instead of producing millions of new cars every year. So it needs to be dramatically downsized if we're going to have a sustainable planet. Those are the things we need to do across the whole economy: autos, aviation, shipping. That's just transportation.
I'm Taylor. I have a question for you as far as the nationalization of, it sounds like most of the economy, honestly, would be, especially man-fab and our natural resources. I used to work for the Forest Service for a number of years, and working for the government, I experienced a lot of corruption within it. There's a tremendous amount of middle management, and whenever you deal with large-scale nationalization, throughout history, at least every instance that I can think of has also been followed by large-scale corruption. And especially when you give the government more power, when you build up government, it allows, possible bad actors to take more of the slice of the pie than we would like. How would you combat corruption with such a large nationalized government?
That's a really good question. I think first of all, we don't really have much of a democracy in our government. So much of the government is out of our hands. We don't get to vote on anything directly. It's all indirect. And there's no particular reason why that should be the case. Like, I'm from California. We do have there a very viable system of voting on propositions, and that's actually pretty democratic. And it's regularly distorted by companies who can spend a lot of money on campaigns and so forth. But the basic idea of voting on big social issues or economic issues is basically a democratic process. I'm all for that. And at the national level or at state level, our governments are indirect. But it's not that we shouldn't have representative government. I'm for that. But in order to do that, you need to have basically the abolition of wealth and huge spread in incomes between people, so that there's not so much incentive to be corrupt. In other words, to do away with corruption, you need to eliminate the incentive to be so corrupt. So I think you need to have a much more democratic, much more egalitarian society with incomes roughly within a reasonable range, so that you don't have billionaires and poor people at extremes. And you need to have election and recall of officials, and they should be paid at reasonable level, the same level as ordinary people, ordinary workers. And you have, in our system, you have this, much of the corruption is because you have a system in which campaign finance is just an open field for corruption. It's just built for that, so that people who get elected to office, it becomes so expensive in this system to run for office because most of the campaigning is done on television, and so people have to pay enormous amounts of money for television time. And so to raise that money, you find office holders get elected, and then the very day after they get elected, they have to start raising money for the next election. And so to get money, they have to get, they could get, $25 from you or me, but the big money they get from corporations and wealthy people. And so, needless to say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So that's kind of the way corruption works. And so you need to abolish all of that so that people can be elected and recalled, and you need to have a democratic process of elections. Like in Europe, in France, for example, I remember I spent a little time there. You have a system in which all parties who gain a certain number of votes at the local level get free airtime on TV. They don't have to pay for TV ads. they get, so that at the 2005 election, when I watched it, there were like 12 different parties competing in that election. And every single one, Sarkozy's party or some radical socialists, they all got the same airtime. They each got a half an hour to present their case on TV, and it stretched over several nights. And so, but they didn't have to pay for it. It was completely free. So it made it feasible for small parties, marginal parties, to actually be heard at the public, at a national level. And so they have, anyway, so they have, that's a small reform, but you could see how that would have a huge impact in this country if you had free airtime for TV. I mean, they basically should, all elections should basically be publicly subsidized, and candidates be given free airtime and so forth, so that they don't have to spend their time raising money from corporations to get elected. Does that somewhat answer your question, Josh?
In a way, obviously, the more you vote on something, the slower it takes. This is very, the more democracy, it's kind of a balancing scale. The more democracy by representation, the faster you normally have things that happen. And the more voting by the proletariat, by the people, the slower things tend to happen. Where's that middle ground for you, as far as not giving our representatives too much power, especially in a very nationalized system, but also giving the people enough time to vote on things?
Yeah. Well, I think you need a hierarchy and a distribution of authority so that as much of the economy can be under local control as feasible. But of course, it doesn't make sense for every local community to make its own computers or grow its own bananas. So you need a certain amount of trade and specialization, and some things produced in large-scale factories, which by nature are not going to be in every state in the union. So you need to have some industries at national level, nationalized, and other industries, local industries, municipalized under municipal control, and various other local. So you need a hierarchy of ownership, public ownership. I'm not saying everything should be nationalized by the federal government, but large corporations like ExxonMobil and Boeing and stuff like that, it's kind of really it doesn't make much sense for Washington State to nationalize Boeing, or Chicago. That's where their headquarters are right now. I mean, it's a national industry. So those large scale industries would need to have those nationalized at the federal level.
Hi, I'm Rosie.
Hi, Rosie.
How would you suggest going about this in a red state, trying to convince people to get on our side?
How do I think we can get people on our side to do this?
In red state.
In a red state.
Like
in the Republican states.
Yeah. Like people, my question is kind of like, how do we convince them? People are convinced that like socialism, like the way we want it, is going to ruin everything. So how do we convince them? Like people that are not on our side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People that don't even believe in climate change.
And they just do, or they just say they don't care. Yeah.
Well, I'm not saying this is easy. This is what the IPC says. We need just a complete transformation of our economic systems if we're going to survive. And so, people by nature, we don't like to change very much. We're kind of lazy. We want to keep the job we've got, and so on and so forth. But the alternative is if we do that, we're not going to be here very long. So we do need to make radical changes. So the question is, change to what kind? What kind of change? And how will that affect people? And I think this will affect people in blue states or red states the same. I think that what I'm trying to argue is that the best option we have to win over those workers in those industries, and there are a lot of industries like that, is to guarantee them jobs in something else that will pay them the same amount. That's the only way we can win their support for doing what they need to do to save themselves and their future. And it doesn't matter whether it's a red, you know, I just think this is going to be, right now, it doesn't seem like, right now all this seems like kind of pie in the sky. But when the temperature heats up more and the forests are burning pretty much constantly, and drought, we have the collapse of agriculture and so forth, you know, then people are really going to see more and more now that there's no solution to this short of stopping consuming fossil fuel. We can't stop it immediately, but we need to drastically suppress it. And if we're going to drastically suppress it, it's going to put companies out of business. And we have to face up to that and say, yes, it is going to put companies out of business, but we have a solution for that. Because the capitalists will say, or, you know, all the Wall Street Journal will say, oh, you're going to put companies out of business. And so therefore the conversation stops right there. Well, we can't put people out of business, and therefore, so climate change just has to continue until it kills us all. Well, we have to say, look, there is an alternative here. You know, we can take over these industries, we can phase them out, we can shut them down, we can transition and create the industries that we really do need, that are low carbon and so forth. And we can also guarantee those people jobs. So that we have to have a program, a plan, an alternative plan. And this is, I think, and I'm not the only author of this, or other people, I'm not the only person who's calling for nationalizing industries. I quote other people in my paper who also argue for that. And it's pretty obvious, really. You know, it's not any brilliant inspiration here. This is pretty obvious. Because there's only so many ways you can run a modern economy. And so I'm just proposing that it should be done democratically, that everybody who's affected by these decisions should have a say in it. We should have a say in what ExxonMobil does, because it has a huge impact. Whatever it does has a huge impact on planet Earth, on our futures. And so I don't see why we shouldn't have a vote on that.
Hey, Richard, you mentioned politicians needing to go through privately owned corporations to get access to television. A few years ago, when I was reading The Death of the Liberal Class by, what's his name? I don't remember the author's name, but he's the Chris Hedges. His portrayal of the New Deal and the percentage of programs that were about cultural transformation, hiring theater troops to travel the country, and the sense that people had about how they change their culture. I'm wondering if you could give us a hint of how an effective Green New Deal would wade into our media landscape, and how we change the narrative, tell the right story, and have a more socialist perspective in charge of the news.
I have to say that I'm an economist. I'm an environmental economist, and a historian. So this is a bit beyond my specialty, my pay grade here, you know, cultural stuff. But, you know, no, I'm trying to finish a couple of books. As soon as I get these books done and get on my way, I've got a stack of books I want to read on the New Deal, the original New Deal. It's just so interesting. I just marvel every time I go to some city and see some magnificent train station built by, like we have here in New York, built as a WPA project in the 1930s, or some beautiful murals in buildings as part of the WPA art project. And or I listen on the radio to the narratives of slaves and their children who were recorded in the 1930s as part of as a WPA project of cultural memory. It was a period of such incredible creativity when people were encouraged to go out and do art and perform and engage with society about serious matters. And it's just, when I look at it, it's just hugely inspiring to me, you know? And so much of that exists still today. I mean, the physical infrastructure, the railway stations, the train stations, the post offices, mostly they still exist today. We use that infrastructure. So it was a marvelously creative period in the 1930s and 40s of the original New Deal. And I think that a new Deal could go even far beyond that. So I look forward to it as a freeing of creativity and an encouragement to really use our imaginations.
I know you touched on this a bit. I was just wondering if you could go a little more in depth. You talked about how our nationalization of companies such as Exxon and BP is going to impact the economies of countries whose resources we are using, such as Saudi Arabia. There are so many countries whose economies have been like completely decimated by Western colonialism and then rebuilt around export to the US as means to profit. So what does like reconstruction of economy look like for them if and when they have to stop sourcing product to the US, such as oil? Like, what's the process for that without a complete economic nosedive and more, you know, widespread collapse and poverty in those places than is already prevalent?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We owe them a lot, and we need to help them transition. We need to help. I mean, we're an industrial center, so we can provide Brazil or the Caribbean islands or Africa or places like that that have been systematically ripped off for centuries. We can provide them with windmills and solar power and so forth, and we can do this for free. Well, why not? Because we need to help them, and they need the help, and they deserve it. So there's a long overdue payback here for the history of American imperialism, and Americans have to face up to it. That, you know, this is our responsibility to them. You know, Americans, you know, a lot of Americans don't think much about this kind of thing, but they need to think about this.
I agree with you on that front, but how do you avoid the slippery slope of, you know, large industrial companies, much of the Western world, coming in under the guise of helping and, you know, wreaking further havoc, such as like the UN did in many parts of Africa, and, you know, various other Western countries. You know, that's like, I feel like there's a long tradition of Western cultures fucking up and then trying to go back and fix it and making it worse, rather than actually like putting that power into the hands of communities.
Yeah, you're right. I agree. Well, first of all, we would nationalize these large corporations and put them under public control so that they wouldn't have the profit incentive to go loot the third world. Secondly, I think we need to reduce our industrial production by, I don't know, half or 2/3 anyway, because so much of what we make is just such a waste. And so, I mean, I live in New York City, and I look around me, you know, in the middle of Manhattan, you know, and so much construction of endless condo towers for rich people. It's just all they build here. It's so disgusting. I mean, they're just towers everywhere. It's like Shanghai, you know, and it's just such a total waste. We need to just shut down this construction industry in New York City. It is just such a staggering waste. And so if we reduce a lot of unnecessary production and abolish all kinds of, you know, like disposables and that kind of stuff, there will be a lot less motivation or need to go to get resources in the third world, to loot the third world, to produce the stuff we don't need to produce in the first place. So a dramatic drop in industrial production in the advanced industrial countries. You know, environmentalists call for a kind of a contraction and convergence, which is to say a deindustrialization of the North and an industrialization of the South, but on a non-capitalist basis, on a socialist basis, so that people can produce what they need without making all the problems of capitalism all over again. Like the Chinese could have learned from that, but they didn't. So instead of learning, if they just looked at Los Angeles before they built their auto industry in the 1990s and 2000s, and created freeways and so forth. When I first went to China in the early 90s, you could ride straight across Beijing in like 20 minutes, from one side of the city to the other. Now, there was only one ring road then, but now there are 6 ring roads, and they keep building. Now there's a 7th ring road, They build ring roads and ring roads. It's like freeways in Los Angeles. More and more freeways encourages more and more cars, and the result is just more traffic jams. Well, this is not a very smart way to create a transportation system for a city. So we need to sit down and create better transportation systems instead of having it based on the transportation system based on private production for automobiles and highways and so forth. So in the third world, I think we need to in underdeveloped countries, we need to help them develop in a rational social way so that they create public transportation systems that they need instead of, say, an auto industry. And they might need some cars. I mean, they need some production of cars, but they don't need zillions of cars that are obsolete next year and junked and then replaced with a newer, fancier one. So you need to develop the less developed countries and deindustrialize the advanced industrial countries. Where a lot of things we just don't need, and it's just so crazy. AI and almost everything. It's so ridiculous. We're so over-industrialized, and we consume so much resources for this. It's just completely unsustainable and ridiculous way to live. But it's a big problem, I'll grant you. You need to, and those people need to be mobilized in those countries to insist and demand that they get what they need and not what people in industrialized countries want to give them. So I think democratization here, just broad democratization in the U.S., in the developed countries, and in the undeveloped and developing countries is the best strategy, the best solution in the short run. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. It did very well.
Richard, you've talked a lot about the kind of primary, secondary, and tertiary industries that need to be changed and major spheres of influence. Is there a way for you to draw a straight line between those industries and the primary first order user, the Pentagon, and its role in what reduction and what you're talking about?
I don't know if I categorize them in that way, primary, secondary, tertiary. I was only talking about the fossil fuel industrial complex, mm-hmm. and then its downstream industrial consumers. So I was talking about the oil companies, the coal companies, gas companies, and then the industries that are dependent on those, like autos, airlines, construction, all the transportation industries, and many manufacturing industries, and just about the whole economy is dependent on fossil fuels one way or another. So, but some worse than others. Some were more completely than others. The petrochemical industry could not exist without without fossil fuels. So, if you're going to talk about shutting down or retrenching fossil fuels, then you have to talk about what do we do with DuPont and Monsanto and all these Cargill and so forth, all these chemical companies that petrochemical companies that depend on fossil fuels. So I was thinking about it in those terms, not so much a priority or hierarchy of primary. So
in terms of those concerns, can you draw a link to the military and its use in terms of percentages of reduction, percentages of use?
No, I can't. Obviously, the military is a big share of U.S. industry, directly or indirectly. It consumes a lot of resources, and it's a major polluter too, and mostly uncontrolled. So, and mostly, what's the purpose of the U.S. military? I mean, for centuries, at least, for centuries, it's been largely to maintain the U.S. empire, from which we need resources, whether it's coffee or oil or bananas or bauxite or minerals, so forth like that. So, if we don't need to protect all those resources that we're taking, then we don't need a military of that scope. So I think we could pretty rapidly downsize the military without completely abolishing it at the moment. I mean, I'm not utopian quite in that sense, even though I'm for it in that. In the end, I'm not for quite abolishing it in the immediate short run, because there are other threats out there in the world.
Richard, Dave Jones here. What's your sense of the direction grassroots union folks are headed right now? Do you see them beginning to understand this dilemma we're in and maybe shifting away from their leadership?
Can you say that again? I can't see you. You were just off screen.
Yeah, I'm way over on this corner. I was just wondering if you have a sense for the direction that grassroots union rank and file folk are you feel they're beginning to see the light a little bit, defying their leadership in any way, or if you think that's still the major barrier?
No, I think honestly, I do think that consciousness is rapidly changing on this, and I speak as a person who's been political all my adult life, and gone through a lot of decades in which there's not much change. But right now, things are changing very fast, and I can see that in this room full of students in Missoula, Montana, or the hundreds of thousands of people who turned out last Friday for the climate march strike march here in New York City and all over the world. Like at least 5 million people turned out in marches all over the world. So, Melbourne had something like, I don't know, 200,000 or 400,000 people, and Sydney another 70,000. Just, it's all over the world. So I think that, and also you see in the immediate reception to when AOC got elected, she came into office ready to roll with her. She launched her Green New Deal thing the next week, and it immediately drew massive public support. And if you look at the polls, it's just huge, like 70, 80% of the population is in support of her Green New Deal program. That's pretty amazing. And of course, to many people, it just looks like a jobs program, so they support that, because anything's a jobs program is a good thing. And it also calls for full employment. So obviously, there are a lot of reasons to vote for that. But I think people are increasingly frightened at what's going on, because, we have to deal with this craziness with Trump every day. But you look out, and you see, massive cities and communities all over the Midwest are flooded. California is burning, Montana is burning. It's just, people are very upset and concerned about the environment all over the world. The heating, the drought, the fires, the extinction crises, the oceans, what we're doing to the planet. I think it's getting through to people that we really do need to do something. And that's what Greta speaks to. And I think consciousness is really changing. Now, of course, doing something requires a specific kind of plan to get out of this. And so that's what I'm working on here, and what other people are working on. I'm probably the only one, lots of people working on this. So we have to come up with plans, plural, to get ourselves out of this. But I think that's the real challenge for you people, because it's your future, and there's just no end of need for your creativity here in this. So I really encourage people to whatever field you're in, whether it's liberal arts or science or whatever, really, there's just so much need for a breakthrough in thinking about what we need to survive as a species and how we can live a better life. And by the way, you know, when I'm talking about this stuff about shutting down industries and so on, I'm not talking about austerity here. I'm talking about creating an economy that gives us more freedom and more spare time, more non-work time, because we don't need to have an economy making stuff over and over and over again, you know? And we don't need to have an economy making stuff that we don't need. We need an economy that produces what we need. And if we have that, then we can have more time to develop our creativity, both at work and outside of work. And so that's what I'm looking for. Not just, I'm not just talking about the negative side of it, which is that yes, we do need to shut down industries. Some, many, but still. We have others we need to create.
Hey, Richard, could you share a little bit about being a scholar of China and things you hear as a New Yorker, as a DSA member, broadly, culturally, and how you would fix those perceptions of what's going on in China?
Well, China's it's a different system. It's not socialism, that's for sure. And it's extensively capitalist, but it's not fully capitalist. It's a different economic system. It's bureaucratic collectivist. It's a party state rules. It's a party state dictatorship. And so it's a huge economy. And it has a whole set, I don't particularly want to go into the details of it right now here, but it has an economic logic, a set of drivers which are different than, to a large extent, different than capitalism. And so in that system, it makes sense for state-owned industries to produce steel and aluminum that they can't sell. And it makes sense to build ghost cities that no one's ever going to live in. And it makes sense to pollute without restraint, and so on and so forth. It's a different kind of system than capitalism, and it makes for quite a horrific environment for people. I would just say, I wrote a couple of articles on this, and I have a book coming out with Pluto next July, I think, on this topic on China's environmental crisis. But if you want to know something about China, I'd suggest two articles. One's called China's Communist Capitalist Ecological Apocalypse. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful, I'm sorry. But it's, I couldn't resist since it all hangs together. China's Communist Capitalist Ecological Apocalypse. And that'll tell you sort of about the overproduction. It has lots of pictures and stuff like that, okay? And then the other one is called China's Drivers and Global Ecological Collapse. They're kind of the same, but the Drivers article is about the internal logic in the party bureaucracy, and so it develops that. Those two are kind of the basis of my book. So you can just Google those. Just Google the title, and it'll come up right away. So you can read that in detail. They're not real long, like 30 pages, something like that. So I would recommend you take a look at that. Anyway, it's an economy that has a different logic. It's basically, instead of being geared to profit, it's geared to the salvation of the Communist Party of China. Everything is geared to that. And so it makes sense to keep workers working, building cities that nobody's going to ever live in, because they would rather have those workers working than out in the street starving. The capitalists in the West don't care if workers get thrown out in the street and are starving. That's their problem. But in China, it's the Communist Party's problem, because the Communist Party made a revolution nominally in the interest of the working class, and it calls itself a socialist party and so forth, Communist Party. And so it pretends to represent the workers. So it can't afford to have workers standing around. So right now, during the trade war, when industries are shutting down, a friend of mine in Shanghai told me that the state has ordered industries that are closing, even closing down, or cutting back or, hardly working at all, not to let the workers out on the street. Keep them in the factories. Make them do something, sharpen the tools or do something. Keep busy. Because we don't want them out in the street. Because they're out in the street, they'll start protesting, and they don't want that. They'll look like Hong Kong. So they're very concerned to keep the engine going, even if it's producing stuff that neither the Chinese nor anyone else wants. So like there's a big pile of, I cited this in one of those papers. There's a huge pile, like a mountain of aluminum ingots sitting in a desert in Mexico from China. What's it doing there? Well, they were trying to sneak it in as made by Mexican industries because there are limits on how much aluminum and steel can be imported to the U.S. So they tried to pretend it was from Mexico, but their cover was blown on that, and so now they can't do it. It's just sitting there. So this is, these are the kind of crazy things that go on in China. So if you want to know more about that in detail, have a look at my articles on that. Okay. Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about green capitalism. I know you've written Green Capitalism, the God That Failed. And what the role of green capitalism or green technology might be in our transition to an eco-socialist country, or if there is a role for it.
Well, of course we want green technology. That's the only kind of technology we want, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, yes and no, because the fact is that there's some goofy people in the green capitalist world, like Paul Hawken. He wrote a bunch of books, and he sort of imagined that all industries could be transformed into sort of like biological, so that every industry consumes the waste of another, and so on and so forth. It was pretty far-fetched. But nonetheless, to the extent that we can, we want that kind of economy, but we want things fully recycled, and we want to minimize resource consumption. So that's true, but we have to face it, that some industries are just inherently dirty, and there's not much you can do about it. If you mine iron ore, or you mine copper, I mean, it's just, or you drill oil, or just any kind of thing. Many kinds of things that we take from nature are just inherently dirty processes. So what we want to do is try to minimize our need for those things and try to contain the production of them in such a way as it's not a waste for society and so forth. So for example, in your average smartphone there that you've all got in your pocket, and mine sitting on my desk here, there is a bit of coltan and some other rare earths. Well, those rare earths are mined, the coltan is mined especially in the eastern Congo, in the Ituri rainforest, an area inhabited mostly by pygmies. And children are doing the mining. It's found in mud. And so it's mostly been used to, the marketization of this mineral has been used to enslave children, to extract this coltan from mud and dig down into caves and so forth to get it. And this is just so horrific. It's so sad. Well, maybe the world needs a little bit of coltan, but can't we do it in such a way that it doesn't cost the lives of children? And can't we do it in such a way that we don't need endless consumption of it? So like if an iPhone, for example, could be made to be regularly upgradable forever, basically. I mean, there's no reason why this iPhone sitting on my desk here, which is a Model 6 iPhone, no reason that phone can't last for decades. The only reason it won't last for decades is because Apple will come out with a new version of its operating system and so forth, and its electronics, so that you will be forced to lose your phone, as they say. You'll be forced to trade your phone in or throw it away or something in order to get the new one. And this is just such a waste. You need to design a product like a phone to be completely upgradable to the extent possible and reusable and also shareable. We can share things. We don't have phones, maybe not so easily, but we don't need to, do we all need to have our own appliances for every little thing. You know, like a friend of mine lived in an apartment building where instead of every apartment having its own washer dryer, they had one washer dryer room per floor. There were like 20 apartments on the floor, and they all got to use the same washing machine and dryer, and then they didn't have to have it in their own apartment. That made a lot of sense to me, rather than everyone having one in their own apartment. Of course, if you live in an individual house, you know, that's different. But, you know, but in many ways, there are many ways to share things rationally and reasonably so that we don't need to, but you have to start with a plan like that. You know, not just an anarchic approach to building apartments. Every apartment in New York has its own washer, dryer, and everything else, you know, these days. But so you need to have a plan to minimize the amount of resources that we need to consume in order to have a reasonable lifestyle, and then control the production of those resources so that we're not, you know, exhausting children to do this.
I definitely agree with you, but like I have an iPhone 6S or whatever. And what I think you might know this, what Apple will do is they'll purposely like slow down your phone and stuff, so you have to buy a phone.
Right.
And that's how they're a $1 billion company. Like they just make a crap ton of money off of you. And
right.
I totally agree with the way of sharing, you know, making a phone last a really long time, but that doesn't seem like profitable to Apple. So how do we sway companies like that to?
Well, I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry, but we just have to nationalize Apple. And okay. we just have to nationalize Apple and create an industry that produces phones that can be perpetually upgraded. Mm-hmm. And so they won't need to produce anywhere near as many iPhones as they do. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be a much smaller production. You know, you have young people. I mean, in my book on China, the first chapter has a poem written by this iPhone worker at a Foxconn factory who committed suicide by jumping off the roof of his building because he was just so alienated by the work life that he had, working 16 hours a day to make a stupid iPhone, doing the same repetitive process over and over and over for years on end. And he was just a young man, like 24, and he was a poet. And he wrote a lot of poems, and then he killed himself. I mean, hundreds of workers in China have jumped off the roof of their factories in desperation because of the pace of work in Foxconn factories. Foxconn's a Taiwanese company that operates in China. The pace of work to crank out these new iPhones, this latest model, the latest iteration. We just have to break that whole industrial system apart and start all over again. I'm not saying we should, you know, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not saying we should go back to living from the ages before cell phones, but we need to find a way to make them upgradable, and so we're not driving people to jump off of roofs because of the horror of the life of manufacturing these things at the highest possible speed, or children being enslaved in the Congo to get the minerals to go into these things. So yeah, the short answer is we have to nationalize Apple, just take it over, make it a public corporation. And by the way, the same goes for other things. You know, if you look at, just look at the industrial structure. Look at Google. What is Google? Google's not a search engine. Google is an advertising agency. Everything that's wrong with Google about selling your data, and Facebook too, you know, everything that's wrong about those is because they're private corporations looking to maximize the profit. That's the whole source of their problem. Boeing, you know, Boeing need, you know, they instead of designing a proper new airplane of the 737, the old 737 was a pretty okay plane, but instead of building a new plane, they wanted to save money, so they hot rodded the old plane. They just put bigger engines on it, and then, because the engines were too big and upset the geometry of the flying airplane, they had to create some crazy software to try to mangle it, keep it under control when it threatened to get out of control. I mean, it's just, the basic airplane is just a bad design. They just need to cashier this plane and start over again. Boeing can't afford to do that because they have all this investment tied up in that plane. But again, Boeing should just be nationalized. And then society can say, okay, what do we want? Do we want safe airplanes here, or we want high profit airplanes? What's the goal here? So these are the kinds of decisions, that the kinds of discussions we need to have about every major company in the economy. Really, you know, it's, I mean, the need for for transformation of our whole industrial economy is so great because it's such a huge juggernaut of planetary destruction that your generation is not going to survive this unless we do something about it. Of course, we live in a system, and so we take it as natural. And so this is, oh, well, how can we change Apple? I mean, it's a huge corporation, or GM, or Boeing, or whatever. But we have to think about that. We have to put those discussions on the table. We have to talk to people and say to people, look, this is what we have to do. We have to not completely shut down Boeing, but we have to dramatically retrench Boeing so they make many fewer airplanes, and we need to ration air flights. We can't be flying all over the world all the time. It's just so crazy, you know? Airbnb and cheapo air and so forth. Everybody thinks, oh, well, let's just get on the plane and go to Cancun or Paris or Hong Kong or something. You know? I mean, you know, we can do that, or we can have a habitable planet. But we really can't do both, you know? I mean, you know, I grew up as a kid in Seattle, and I think I had I never thought of going to any of those places, but I didn't feel like I was deprived. Actually, I had pretty nice, just a working class family, but I thought we had a pretty nice life, really, you know. I went camping and hiking and boating and, you know, around Washington and Vancouver, Canada, and I never missed not flying to Cancun or not. Yeah. Anyway, so in some sense, you know, we have to say yes. There are some things we're going to have to do without. We're going to have to ration them and do them, you know, once in a while, once in a blue moon, but not you know, on a regular basis. In order to, because there are trade-offs here. We can do that. If we do that on a regular basis, like we're doing now, you know, ever increasing numbers of airplane flights, we're not going to have a planet. So we have to do fewer. We have to say, okay, well, we have to fly less, a lot less. Doesn't mean we never can fly, but we have to fly a lot less. So then we have to decide socially, you know, what's a reasonable amount to fly? What can the environment tolerate? What can we do acceptably? So these are the kinds of discussions we need to have. But we'll have more time for these discussions because we won't be working ourselves to death making stuff that we don't need.
I'm from Anacortes, by the way.
You what? You're from Anacortes?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. No. Okay.
How would you propose we nationalize companies?
I'm sorry, can you speak up a little bit? I can't quite hear you.
Yeah, how do you propose we nationalize companies in an eco-socialist government?
I'm sorry, how would I propose that I still can't hear you, I'm sorry. It's my microphone on my, you know, or whatever it is, the microphone, it's too far away.
Okay, how do you propose we nationalize companies in an eco-socialist government?
How do I propose to nationalize companies?
In an eco-socialist government.
Yeah, okay. So you came in late, so I'm going to tell you I'm going to suggest you look at this article I wrote called An Eco-Socialist Path to Limiting Global Temperature Rise to 1.5 degrees C. Just Google it. Google An Eco-Socialist Path. That's good enough. It will come up, okay? And there's a long discussion of nationalization there in the conclusion of the article where it talks, just before it talks about AOC's plan. But what I propose is that society should buy out these companies. And I did a little quick math here, which I ran by an economist friend of mine who said it was actually okay, the math, which is that society could take over all the oil companies, all the coal companies. There aren't very much. Let me just give you some quick numbers here. Okay. As of December 2018, the 10 largest American oil and gas companies claimed a net value of $968 billion. ExxonMobil is valued at $344, and Chevron at $239, and ConocoPhillips at $79, so on. Okay, And the coal companies are hardly worth anything. And I mean, like Arch is barely 1.5 billion. And then the downstream utilities, all the airlines have a combined market capitalization of $130 billion. The American auto industry, the whole thing, Ford, GM, Tesla, excluding Chrysler, which is bought out by Italy's Fiat, they have a combined net worth of $277 billion. The big dirty three of petrochemical companies, Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, and 3M, combined are worth $225 billion. The government could buy all of those, that is the commanding heights of the the fossil fuel industrial complex, for $727 billion. And then you could add in the bulk of private and shareholder-owned gas and electric utilities. With that comes to another $557 billion. And in other words, the government could buy up all of America's fossil fuel producers and the bulk of its fossil fuel burners for $2.26 trillion. I thought that was amazingly cheap for the commanding heights of the American economy. 2.26 trillion, yeah, and still have some change left over. And one way to pay for that was, I suggested, there are many ways one could pay for that, but one obvious way would be to just rescind President Trump's $3 trillion tax giveaway, $2.3 trillion tax giveaway to the rich this last year. That alone would pay for this whole program. And there are many other tax giveaways that, as Josh was talking about earlier, right? About all the tax giveaways, since the days of Reagan and long before that. So I was actually surprised to see how cheap it would be. I mean, it's a big economy, but really not, trillion here, a trillion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money, but still, it's surprisingly cheap. Okay, yes.
Has Bernie Sanders or AOC ever talked? Have they ever or any Democrats or any politicians? Do you know of any that have talked about buyouts, buying companies out and nationalizing companies?
No. Not one of them. No one has even broached the topic yet.
Okay.
That we need industrial shutdowns. I mean, what everybody says is we need a transition to renewable energy and we need to phase out fossil fuels. But no one yet has said publicly that, if we phase out fossil fuels, doesn't that mean we're going to have to shut down companies? You don't hear those words. You will never hear those words.
Why?
You won't
You're
not hearing that.
Considering the danger that kind of sentiment being publicly displayed would create a lot of opposition among big money.
Of course. Yeah, sure. And my argument is that yes, we need to give them a deal they can't resist. That is, we need to nationalize them and say, we will buy you out at your stock market value. That is, we're not going to expropriate you. We'll buy you out at your stock market value. And we'll guarantee you a buyout, and we'll guarantee the workers new jobs with the WPA program. So that's my sort of non-violent proposal for nationalization. The other alternative would be hanging them from lampposts, but we're not going to do that. We're going to buy them out. So I just think nobody's talking about this, but the argument that I'm making in that paper is that very soon they're going to have to talk about this, because if AOC's program were ever to be taken seriously, and you talk about when the conversation gets to, oh, AOC, okay, so you want to decarbonize the economy. Okay, so how do you decarbonize ExxonMobil? To decarbonize ExxonMobil is to bankrupt ExxonMobil, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's what they make, is oil, right? What can you do? So you have to be talking about nationalizing them, because otherwise you're just talking about expropriating the company and throwing all those workers out of work. I can see that it's not just the rich people, not just the owners of the companies that are going to be pissed off. It's the workers. So we need to be out front of that on this issue. We need to have a plan, which is to say, yes, I'm very sorry. We do have to close down oil companies and coal companies and auto companies and airlines. And we have to drastically retrench Boeing, and a lot of fossil fuel companies need to be closed or retrenched. But we have a plan for that. We're not proposing to collapse the economy, and we're not proposing to throw people out of work. We're going to give you a guaranteed buyout for your company, and you have to accept it, because if you don't accept it, your children will not survive either. So we're going to buy you out. And we're going to give you a price that you can't say no to, because we're going to pay you the fair market share of your company right now. We're going to buy you out, and we're going to guarantee jobs to your workers. That is what I see are those are the two pillars on which any decarbonization plan has to be based on. And that, for right now, this is just talk, but this is the kind of talk we need to be having, because no one else there's no other answer out there. And I'm not saying I'm the only one there. There are other people that say this stuff too. But, the question always comes down, in discussions of carbon taxes and so on and so forth, that, well, you're going to throw companies out of business, and if you do that, then masses of people are going to be out of work, and so on and so forth. I quote this guy from, it's great, the Heritage Foundation. He says, about a carbon tax. I explain here why carbon taxes don't work. It can't work in my paper. But the guy from the Heritage Foundation, he says, he says the carbon tax. He says he's talking about what the IPCC said. I'll go back to this a little bit. But the IPCC said, the people that made that report that I quoted from at the beginning, right? The IPCC people said, well, what we need is to ramp up carbon taxes to a really punitive level, so that people will, this will force companies to cut back production. And what the Heritage Foundation, that's a right-wing think tank, what they said is that the carbon tax is a blueprint for destroying the world economy. And you know what? He's right about that. I agree. Because the carbon tax is it's such a dumb proposal, carbon tax. The idea of carbon tax is that you would impose a tax on companies. And so, like, a cost on carbon, on gasoline and fuel oil and so forth like that. And then that would force people to go buy non-fossil fuel energy. And therefore, it would force the fossil fuel companies eventually out of business. It would drive them out of the market. That's the economic logic of, kind of capitalist approach. But this is so crazy, because what that would do, first off, is it would bankrupt the companies, throwing their workers out of work. That's not going to be very popular. And secondly, the tax would be a punitive imposition on ordinary working people. And that's why Washington State, which last year had or in 2016, I guess, had 2018, had a proposal on the ballot for a carbon tax, and it failed, because people could see that this was going to cost them, but they were not going to get a gain from this, because you can't take a savings of people can't just go out and buy an electric car. That costs a lot of money, and they mostly don't have a choice but to consume fossil fuel for heating oil, because what else are you going to do? Electric heating. You're from Anacortes, right? I grew up in Seattle, and we had electric heating in all the houses because we had Grand Coulee Dam, right?
Yeah, majority of Washington is powered by the Grand Coulee Dam, so we're lucky to be powered.
Yeah, we were lucky in that case. Yeah, some Canadians were in the same situation, but most people have to. I'm in New York now. People here all heat with oil,
Yeah.
So what do they do? I mean, we have an oil boiler in our building. I live in a cooperative building, an oil boiler in the basement. What are we going to do? Like, if they put a carbon tax on the oil, we're going to go down and rip out this boiler and replace it with solar panels? I don't think so. You know, it's just not feasible. You need a whole, much more comprehensive approach to the problem than that.
Yeah.
So that's why these things get voted down. You know, in France, Sarkozy, you know, he wanted to save the ecology, and so he imposed a carbon tax. He was going to impose a carbon tax, and the French people revolted. You know, you've heard of the yellow vests movement. You know, all these workers out there in their yellow traffic vests. You know, they were protesting in the streets and raising hell because, you know, they couldn't afford to go buy the least expensive electric car in France. A Renault Zoe cost 27,000 euros. And they couldn't afford to replace the heaters in their house. So instead of giving them subsidies, he was imposing a tax, a penalty on them, which made it even harder for them to afford by raising the price of gasoline and diesel fuel. It made it even harder for them to afford any kind of transition. So anyway, as I explained in the paper, carbon taxes are doomed to fail. But that's what the business wants to talk about, because carbon taxes are really an excuse not to suppress fossil fuel consumption. They want to make it just a tax on the cost of doing business, like sales tax and so forth. You know, and then, you know, corporations like ExxonMobil, they support carbon taxes because they want to be seen as good corporate citizens. You know, we pay our carbon tax and we're contributing to the solution. And meanwhile, we're selling more oil every year, and you're buying it. Well, that's the problem. So. Yeah.
Even if there is a carbon tax, people are still going to be producing carbon, right? Like still producing fossil fuels, even if there is a tax on carbon, right? So it just contributes to the problem, or like.
Say again?
So like, even though there is, so what you're saying kind of is, even though there's a carbon tax, people are still, like companies are still going to be producing carbon, they're still going to be producing fossil fuels, even though there's a carbon tax, kind of? Is that what you're saying? Like it just contributes to the problem?
Yeah, see, because the carbon tax is just a tax on the cost of doing business. And the only places where they pass carbon taxes, like in British Columbia, for example, they passed a carbon tax. Lots of places have passed carbon taxes. If you read my article, it tells you all the ones that passed it. But the problem is, they only pass a carbon tax that's tiny. It doesn't have much impact. It doesn't cost you very much, but it also doesn't really change much. Because if the taxes were heavy enough to really force companies, I mean, the strategy of the carbon tax is to make fossil fuels so expensive that you'll be forced in the marketplace to go someplace else to renewable energy. But if they made them so heavy that people actually were forced to, then they couldn't afford to. So the result is that governments try to pretend like they're solving the problem by passing a carbon tax here and there. But like the British Columbia carbon tax is an abject failure. It hasn't done anything at all. There are articles about that. You can look up the failure of British Columbia carbon tax. Just Google it. So the point is that the carbon tax is just a tax on the cost of doing business. It does not impose a cap on production. It doesn't limit. The companies can keep on producing every year, but they just pay a tax on it. Okay? The previous method, you know, there have been two general approaches to this. One is the cap and trade plan. You've probably heard of those, right? They didn't work either. I talked about them in my Green Capitalism article. Under the cap and trade idea, it was a kind of the idea of the cap and trade was that a government would set a limit on the total amount of fossil fuel consumption or emissions that they could produce. And so and each year it would ratchet the level down a little bit. So it would put a cap on emissions. And then people would be forced to go buy something else. But the problem with that was that it wasn't easy for people to transition. So the consequence was that all the cap and trade schemes failed. They've not succeeded anywhere. There are lots of cap and trade schemes in Europe, and all they did was all they did was make the bankers wealthy who traded these things, but they didn't affect any dramatic change in fossil fuel consumption. So Obama tried to pass a cap and trade plan in the Congress, and that failed. So the only thing that they're talking about these days is a carbon tax. And the carbon tax is actually acceptable. The industry is totally opposed cap and trade because they didn't want a cap on oil production. Well, the carbon tax doesn't impose a cap, so they're acceptable to them. They'll say, okay, fine. So we'll pay a tax and we'll have we'll put a carbon tax on our oil production and we'll carry on. So, but that doesn't suppress fossil fuel consumption. So fossil fuel consumption is going up every year, carbon tax or no carbon tax. So these are the problems with those kinds of solutions. Mostly the cap and trade and the carbon tax are really not designed to suppress emissions and fossil fuel consumption. They're designed to prevent that happening. They're designed to postpone it, to delay it, or to minimize it to the extent possible. There's an easy way to suppress fossil fuel consumption. Roosevelt did it in World War II. He just said that, all right, right now, from this day forward, you shall make no more gasoline-powered automobiles. We're only going to make Jeeps and tanks and warplanes and that kind of thing. So that's it. No more cars. So they didn't produce any cars from 1942 through the end of the war. They didn't produce. They stopped. Those companies all were forced to turn and start producing something else. And they rationed fossil fuel. They rationed gasoline. So my parents had ration cards for gasoline. They could drive, but they just couldn't drive huge amount. So you couldn't do cross-country trips or something like that. So that's what we need to do. We need to ration fossil fuels and suppress the consumption. That's a direct intervention by the government. But of course, companies don't like any direct intervention by the government. They want, it's a market solution here. We don't want to force it. We don't want command and control by the government. We only want market solutions where people are incentivized to do these things. So that's why they want to push carbon taxes and cap and trade and schemes like that. So anyway, you can read the details.
Hey, Richard, are you familiar with Jeremy Rifkin's Third Industrial Revolution take? And I'm curious if you have to encounter people pointing to that as a solution or a new approach to green capitalism. Yeah, curious if you hear about that in economic circles.
I confess I haven't read that book.
Okay.
I'm a little bit familiar with the other tax solutions, but one thing Jeremy Rifkin did, which other economists don't want to do, is he did actually at some point, and I quoted him from a different book in my Green Capitalism article, where he said he was actually one of the few capitalist economists who actually said, "Oh, there are limits in the system. We really can't do this. We really do have to have limits." And his solution was a technical solution, which I didn't think was very plausible, and I explained why. But at least he did see that there were limits in the system. Look at my Green Capitalism article. I discussed it there. But I'm sorry, I haven't read anything since then of Jeremy Rifkin's.
Okay.
Any other questions?
One more. Are you then a big supporter of Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, or do you want to make modifications to it?
You mean Bernie's latest, or
the $17 trillion Green New Deal?
I haven't read it in detail. In general, I'm in favor of Green New Deals if they're real, and I would imagine Bernie's would be pretty good, but I don't know. I haven't read it. He does actually. I think he does one thing. I think Bernie does say in there, which is what I said in this article here. He does call for an explicit jobs program for those workers who are laid off in fossil fuel companies. He does make that explicit pitch, and that's a good thing. I support that. Yeah. So I mean, probably there are not huge difference between AOC's Green New Deal and Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal. And I'm a very strong Bernie Sanders supporter. So, yeah, I support that.
All right, I think that's all our questions for you, Richard.
I've exhausted you for people to sit there for 2 hours listening to me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.